Frictionless borders, swift logistics, stuff that we all dream about, but as we know, it's not easy to achieve. For one, we are at a time of increasing geopolitical tensions, and then we also have to think about technology and innovation, as David just mentioned. How do we leverage cutting-edge technology to deliver seamless operations? I'd like to invite a panel of speakers who will be discussing that. May I please have you on stage, gentlemen? And as they come and take their seats, I'd like to remind everybody that we encourage you to use social media and talk about GLF. And if you are doing that, then please use our official hashtags, that is GLF24 and GL Forum. Thank you. Let me please begin by introducing our panel over here. Right next to me, Poul Hansen. He is the Chief of Trade Facilitation at UNCTAD. Next to him, we have James Laneghan. He is the CEO of Global Custom Compliance. And Umberto de Preto, he is the Secretary General at IRU. Paul, when I say border frictions, what comes to your mind?
Thank you, Pavni. And first of all, let me take this opportunity to congratulate the Kingdom for this event. I think it has been exceptional so far, and we look forward to collaborate with you in the future. On the question, from our point of view and our experience, 2 points come to mind: coordination and cross-border exchange of data. Many of the countries we are working with are developing countries, and there we see that the issue of coordination between border authorities is has still a far way to go. Customs in general are very well versed in the border issue as the frontline agency, but many of the other agencies definitely have things to catch up with, and the coordination between these authorities is quite often lacking. And without that coordination, and importantly, the coordination between the public authority and the private sector, then it becomes increasingly difficult to have efficient supply chains. The other issue that I see and we see is the cross-border exchange of data. We can exchange physical goods, but the exchange of data across borders is often lacking. We are talking about single windows at national level, but when it comes to crossing the border, there is a gap. And I think this gap is really a game changer. Can we get the data across the border? Then we are avoiding to recapture data again and again and again, and that will considerably cut down the time that we use on international trade.
Thank you. Umberto, can you give us the perspective from the road transport industry, please, on border frictions?
Yeah, from a business side, you have to think that when we arrive at a border, we want predictability. We want that when we get to the customs border, we know what we have to do. We know what documents we have to provide, what data we have to provide in advance, and that's not always the case. We need harmonization, which we don't have. If we think about it, when we have our drivers that arrive with the trucks and they're waiting not hours, but days, and in some cases even weeks before they get from one side to another, that's absolutely not sustainable. And from a business perspective, it's just you're running at a loss. Luckily, there are instruments available, such as the tier system, that allows our to have first and foremost harmonization in what we do, allows us to send pre-declarations to customs. And here in the Kingdom, they've actually adopted this, and we've had a 5-fold increase from last year in terms of the usage. Why? Because not only do we have facilitation, we have security. We've reduced the time to get across the border by 92%. We've reduced our costs by 50%. And by doing this, then we're talking about sustainability. We're actually being able to say, how do we get our goods to market more effectively and in a way that is predictable, in a way that actually benefits the industry, benefits trade, and benefits the country.
James, both the gentlemen mentioned customs. Do you want to jump in?
Well, just to chip in, I think both very good points by the other panelists. I think the thing for me, a core thing, is that most of you will recognize that customs are the agency at the border that most of you are most familiar with. But customs are performing an agency function on behalf of many other OGAs. And I think in terms of the delays and frictions at the border, most of this probably could be attributed to the requirements of the OGAs. In the WTO, customs is responsible and answerable for a number of trade facilitation agreements and metrics. Many of the OGAs don't have those same pressures. And I think one of the core areas of difference is the application of risk management and trader segmentation, which probably we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yes, I will get to risk management, but I was also wondering, when we talk about frictions, none of you mentioned geopolitics, which is interesting, but for you, James, that we live in a time of increased tensions, as I mentioned, but also increased sanctions. So how does an agency, how does your company as well as all your partners you work with around the world keep pace with changing rules?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear this.
I was talking about sanctions.
Sanctions, yes.
Yes.
Well, one of the problems that are facing trade at this moment is a growing prevalence of sanctions, global political challenges, which you alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. We are now looking at licensing controls, technology. And the Middle East in this area is a particularly great trading hub, which I think has and the sanctions are overarching an issue which needs to be considered when goods are moving to and from this region to others.
Let's talk about technology and innovation, Umberto. What do you think will drive the future of road transport? What kind of innovation are you really banking on? And can you give an example?
It was interesting. The panel before was talking about autonomous vehicles. And it makes me laugh when we say, oh, we're going to have an autonomous truck that goes absolutely everywhere. The autonomous truck will be driven by data, and the autonomous truck will not carry 50 documents to get across a border. That's why at the RU we invested some 30 years ago, and Paul remembers this when we first started at the RU. Paul used to work for the RU. When we first got there, we were putting in place what we called SafeTier, which was a business to customs exchange of data. Before we had already business to business, but how do we have business to customs so that we can declare in advance where we're going, who's coming, what's the truck, who's the driver, where are the goods, where are they going to, so you can have all of the security. But that's just one element. That's just for the transit document. We will need eCMR. We will need e-visas. We will need e-permits. We will need e-everything. And again, if we want to talk about autonomous vehicles, everything has to be data exchange. The frustration in this is that if you look at those 50 documents, 95% of the information on those documents is identical. And yet today, people are actually filling in 50 different documents with the same information rather than just saying, let's go on a platform, fill it in once, and then, oh, I'm moving dangerous goods, so let's just put in this extra form here. And the other thing that's very important for the business sector, and that is IRU, we spent hundreds of millions of Swiss francs to put this in place. When we then spend this kind of money to then communicate with customs authorities, we expect that we have special treatment, and that is that the risk analysis is done in advance, and then they say, please come through, we know who you are, we know you were going, go right through. If we then face the same burdens and impediments as everybody else, why do we spend the money?
You mentioned autonomous vehicles, but before I get to my next question, a quick plug. We are having a panel on autonomous vehicles, and your colleague from the IRU is going to be on it, and I will be moderating, so I hope to, take the conversation there. Paul, to you, what about something like AI? Is that something that you see as a promising technology for trade facilitation at all?
I think we can say that AI is already a technology that's being used, right? But governments especially definitely need to catch up on this. One example of how difficult it is for governments today is the whole e-commerce sector. We are faced with a tsunami of parcels at international level. And in the least part of countries, they are not ready for dealing with this for the individual packages that are coming across the border in tremendous volumes. And therefore, I think governments need to work very closely with the private sector in implementing solutions. And one of these solutions is exactly risk management. How do we manage the risk of these individual parcels to each of us individually that are coming in? One thing is the revenue collection. I think that's rather easy to do, but the other thing is the compliance of these products that are streaming across our borders. Pharmaceuticals, electronics, we need to ensure that there is sufficient compliance for these or for these products. And this is a huge challenge for governments. And I think their AI will be essential to use this in order to manage this tsunami of parcels and products that are coming across the borders.
James, let's get back to risk management that you mentioned first. What kind of innovation are you hoping to get for that?
It's a good question, and one interconnected with Poul's response. I think the key thing in order to conduct risk management is the quality of the data. And for instance, we're talking about perhaps blockchain as a potential solution. Blockchain can protect the integrity of the data, but blockchain doesn't guarantee that that data is actually correct in the first place. And I think the key to the integrity of the data and the quality of the data is capturing it as soon as possible, ideally at export, ideally linked to the export invoice. I think that if customs have access to data which is verifiable, data which is accurate, and data which arrives in good time before the cargo arrives, then they have an opportunity, a chance to use the AI and big data and risk management systems to expedite the clearance of the goods. I think the biggest challenge is the quality of the data. And I think blockchain is just one part of that answer.
There are also digital gaps, right? I mean, I think, Paul, you mentioned you worked a lot with developing countries. I'm sure the IRU does as well. So, Umberto, can you tell me a little bit about how to bridge, sort of what work you're doing to bridge these digital gaps? Because often you will have countries who are at different development levels.
When we talk about technology, this is something where the underdeveloped world can actually leapfrog. And without having to put in place all the modern systems that took the developed world a long time to implement, you can actually just go and put in place. But it's required, though, to do that is political will. You have to have the governments to say, yes, we want to do it. Yes, we want to go the simple path of technology and say, this is what we will do. And have the courage to say, we will do this for the right reasons, including to get rid of the environment that is conducive to corruption. As I mentioned, when we have weeks to get from one side to the other, that is an environment that is conducive to corruption. If we can speed that through, then all of a sudden you get that environment that is gone, and an environment that actually speeds the goods through. And by putting in place technology, you have win-win-win. You have economic development, you get rid of your corruption, and you actually even help the environment by getting those trucks through more quickly.
I think on the gaps issue, it's a very good question. There are, for example, ASEAN, you would have Singapore, who is, I think, regarded as a world leader in the use of digitization and technology. Within ASEAN, you have Laos and Cambodia. These are poorer countries, more challenged economically, and they would struggle to maintain the same level of standards and investment as Singapore. So ASEAN is adopting, I guess, a common approach where the slowest dictates the pace. That perhaps is one way of approaching it. I think the challenge is maybe to capacitate those developing countries, those that don't have these resources, to a certain level, an acceptable level where everyone can move forward. But I think the developing world is not going to progress without plenty of technical support from the likes of UNCTAD and the IRU, that's for sure.
Paul, do you want to talk about how lack of standardization creates inefficiencies and what needs to be done to address that issue specifically?
Yeah, I think it links very well what James and Umberto just mentioned here. And the fact is that we have international standards. There are standards everywhere. Yeah. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, the TIR Convention is an international standard. There are so many international standards. So the question is, how do we get it implemented? It is easy for countries to sign an agreement.
Yes.
Very easy.
Implementation.
It is very difficult to implement and apply these international instruments correctly. And I think that's where organizations like UNCTAD, for instance, are trying to assist many of these developing countries in looking at best practices from other countries, including the kingdom, and trying to say, well, look at what's happening here. You can actually do this or that, and help them implement. But of course, it requires that in each country, there is a foundation of good governance in the country in order to apply these international standards as well. So let's try to focus on what's on the table. Let's try to focus on the integration between these standards and what's happening in the private sector in order to get one system, or at least a few systems that we work on at international level and go in the same direction.
You'd also mentioned public-private partnerships in the beginning. So, as UNCTAD, what is your sort of big focus when it comes to fostering that?
Yeah, so I think that this is really important, the public-private partnership. And again, I point to Umberto. The TIR Convention is a true public-private partnership between an international agreement that is done by the UN and an implementing partner that is the IRU. As Umberto said, I have worked with them as well, so it is in my heart. But there are many of these opportunities, and one of the opportunities that we see is coming from the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement that mandates that each country must have a national trade facilitation committee. It doesn't say how this should be set up, but the best practice points to the fact that it should be consisting of government representatives and the private sector sitting around the table and discussing how do we most efficiently implement solutions for solving the issues on our borders, how to make the border crossing faster, cheaper, and more efficient. And it is solutions like this, based on a public-private collaboration, that we need to focus on, because we as civil servants cannot solve the problems. The private sector cannot on their own solve the problem. So we need to do this in a collaborative effort, and there are mechanisms.
James, what kind of collaborative efforts do you think?
I think the most interesting collaboration that I'm seeing is in blockchain. I think open source logistics, I think, are doing a great thing in terms of having an open source of blockchain, trying to create a data set which meets the minimum standard but which caters for as many needs as possible. I think at the moment blockchain needs this impetus. It needs some, because at the moment there's dangerous digital islands where the blockchain doesn't have enough scalability and not enough connectivity. So I think this is a big area where trade and private sector with government can work together.
Umberto? You know, we started this panel talking about frictions, but I want to end on a more positive, peaceful note. Now, the IRU was founded in the 1940s with 8 countries, I believe, to rebuild Europe. Today, as I mentioned, we have increasing geopolitical tensions. So can trade become a vehicle for peace again? Can swift logistics deliver frictionless borders, as our panel title suggests?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And you said we were created in 48 and 49. We created the tier system, which in 59 became a UN convention. And in fact, it was the late Kofi Annan who said to me in a plane, he couldn't move, he was stuck in front of me. He said, it's the oldest public-private partnership of the United Nations. But if we look at it historically, in Europe, when we started the tier system, we said, how do we get goods from origin to destination? That you inspect the goods at the beginning, inspect them at the end, and it was just with 8 countries, and today we're now in over 100 countries issuing 50 billion euros in guarantees to all the customs authorities, but the purpose remains the same. How do we drive trade? And at the time, think of it, in Europe there were enemies. They just finished Second World War, and the tier system actually allowed enemies to trade with trust, knowing that this truck wouldn't blow up in their face, knowing that that truck would come in and bring trade. What happened with that? It created this whole idea of Europe working together. I still profoundly believe, and this is why I love to get up every morning and go to work, that if we can drive trade, sustainable trade, will drive progress, prosperity, and ultimately peace. Why we'll drive peace is because we'll give hope. Hope to the youth that they'll actually have jobs, they'll be able to have a family with a home, and by doing this, if I'm 18 years old and somebody says you have no future, I'll fight. If you say, I've got a great job available, you're going to have a wife and a dog and your children and everything, I'm not going to fight. Peace will come through trade, peace will come through economic development, through sustainable development.
Thank you. Promising future, right? Thank you. On On that note, we're going to conclude our panel. That's a great way to end, so that's what we're going to do. Thank you all of you for being here, for sharing your insights, and thank you all for attending. Remember, you can use our hashtags GLF Forum or GLF24 to share what we just talked about. Thank you.